Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to AJ117, Introduction to Terrorism and Homeland Security. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So, this week's lecture is going to cover Chapter 3, where we're going to take a look at understanding the Middle East and Islam. So we're going to kind of dive right into to this topic this week. We've got a lot of content to cover, so let's just get right to it. So the world of the Middle East and Islam is very different in comparison to the United States. It is characterized by a unique history, culture, and perspective, typically not observed in the West. And most Westerners have a very limited understanding of the Middle East and Islam, and often it's diluted by stereotypes, misinformation, and inaccurate characterizations by the movies and the media. Movies like Lawrence of Arabia. Now, that's an older movie, and some of you may not remember it, but it's a classic. Even the Sheik of Baghdad, or even the series, The Raiders of the Lost Ark. While they're great movies, really, and they're fun to watch, there is a bit of stereotyping in there. So I think we just need to kind of remember that. And again, we sometimes we think of the Middle East, and we think, certain pictures come to mind, but we really don't have any good information to basically back up what our thoughts might be. Unless, of course, you've been there, then maybe you have a better picture. Now, in contrast, people in the Middle East and other Islamic countries often have a corresponding misunderstanding of Westerners as well. Now, their understanding is often formed by information provided by religious zealots, old American TV shows, MTV, and also the local media. So again, we kind of each have our own perceptions about each other. And I threw some of these pictures in because, they're not the great photos that you really want to see, but there are some differences. And a lot of the differences, honestly, are based on what I just talked about. Not by any firsthand information, but by our perceptions and what we've been told and what we watched and what we see on Facebook and what we read in a book and things like that. So just kind of keep that in mind. So based both on real differences and misconception, terrorism often puts people and cultures against each other. So, again, some Westerners leap to the conclusion that the radical Muslims they hear about on the news from faraway places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, or Chechnya are representatives from all of those countries. So again, it's a perception thing. So even if you look at a cartoon that I pulled from the newspaper, so this is how we each kind of think about each other. And part of this is true because we're just guessing. Again, you look at the two photos, we have different perceptions about each other. So again, kind of to sum some of this up, some Westerners, again, they leap to that conclusion that the radical Muslims that they hear about from faraway places, on the news typically, places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, or Chechnya, are all representatives of all Muslims from those countries, meaning they're all the same, which we know is really not true. Now, conversely, things like drone strikes and news reports of crimes that sometimes are committed by troops confirm the notion to Muslims, if you will. that this is how all Americans are. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So some of these little things give us these misconceptions. So honestly, to genuinely understand terrorism requires more than knowing just a few definitions and laws. Comprehending terrorism in a deeper way requires careful examination of the social, political, and or religious positions taken by the parties involved in, these conflicts, if you will. And after analysis, it may be possible to reach a conclusion about different ideologies. Illustratively, Osama bin Laden urged Muslims to kill Americans wherever they found them because there were no innocent Americans. However, much of the world, including Muslims, were basically repelled by the notion that even a radicalized view of a religion would urge the slaughter of non-combatant children and women. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Now, these things are difficult to accomplish. They just are. But there may be a possibility that we can kind of learn about each other's ideologies. So comprehending the realities involved in insurgencies, civil wars, insurrections, revolutions, or other labels of irregular warfare can be, they can be difficult. And terrorism really is a tactic commonly used in the irregular wars that seem so common in the Middle East. Kind of think about it. Is it morally wrong for the majority to rise up against the minority who impose their will, views, and practices upon them? Now, I'm not condoning some of the things that happen, but I'm just trying to open your mind to think about things, okay? And we're going to look at an example here in just a second. Could both or neither have those best interests in mind? Is it the government or insurgents, both of which who use terrorism, that really represent the best interests of the people? So let's kind of take a look at an example. So these issues that I've talked about, they occupy center stage in the Middle East, where the governments more than occasionally come face to face with groups in their population who violently pursue their visions of the future. And one example was the rise and fall of Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi. And we're going to kind of talk about this right now. So President Mohamed Morsi was democratically elected in 2012. Now, he rapidly lost popular support because he seemed unable to govern. He used excessive force to quell civic uprisings, and economic problems continued to increase in that particular area. Now, even more troubling to a majority of the citizens was that Morsi, a former leader and heavily supported by the Muslim Brotherhood, was basically trying to move Egypt toward an Islamic state, which the military actually opposed. And about 70% of Egyptians were dissatisfied with Morsi, and about 74% lacked confidence in the Muslim Brotherhood to actually govern. So you can see that even in the Middle East, they're having these conflicts. Now, in 2013, after just 1 year in office, the military removed Morsi from power and established an interim government. However, the minority Muslim Brotherhood strongly supported Morsi and demanded his release and reinstatement. And as a result, this led to about 1,000 deaths among military police and anti-Morsi factions. So finally, in 2015, Morsi was arrested and sentenced to death along with over 100 other members of the Muslim Brotherhood in connection to a series of violent jailbreaks during 2001 during the Arab Springtime, and the deaths resulting from the pro-Morsi demonstrations back in 2013. So where now exactly is the Middle East? So let's take a little look at the geography, history, and culture. So the Middle East extends from the western Saharan plains of Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, across the vastness of Libya and Egypt and the deserts of Saudi Arabia to the eastern mountains of Persia and Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. So just to kind of give you a picture of where things are at, and you can kind of take a look here. So all up in here, all the way from here. So you've got quite a bit of area, correct? Now the Middle East consists of over 1 billion people, representing almost every religion and a variety of cultures. It also has significant historical sites, some of which are referred to as the cradle of civilization, in the Nile River Valley in Egypt and Mesopotamia, on the plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates River in Iraq. The geographical vastness of the Middle East produces such diverse cultures that none of them can actually single-handedly represent the region. And the Middle East is also a region of the world dotted with thriving modern metropolitan cities. Cities like Istanbul, Cairo, Tehran, Dubai, where billions of dollars in commerce are exchanged each day. Yet in other areas, people still live as if they did centuries ago, herding a few sheep and making a marginal living, off the land. So, here are some pictures that you can look at. And again, we don't really have this perception, if you will, when we talk about the Middle East, but we do need to understand there are these large technology-based, thriving metropolis-type cities. But mixed in would be these other areas where people are still living today as they did hundreds of years ago. Now this contrast between the coexisting of new and the ancient ways is among the contradictions, or some of the contradictions, that are found in the Middle East. Another key contradiction is that the region hosts historical and implacable enemies of the West, as well as friends and nations who stand shoulder to shoulder with the West. So you've got those that are in favor or stand up for the West, and you have those that do not. So you have these different contradictions. Now, earlier I had mentioned the fact that the Middle East contained several historical sites. And if you've ever been there, I'm sure you had a wonderful time. If you have not, you may want to think about going there. So I have a couple of pictures from when I was on a um, a training mission, if you will, when I was working with law enforcement. So the upper left, and we got a little bit of free time, so that's why I'm not dressed in training gear, etc. But the upper left is the Jordan River. The upper right photo is at the Sea of Galilee. The bottom left is in front of an Israeli police station that's filled with cameras. They do a lot of camera policing, etc. there, so they can monitor areas within that particular city. And then the bottom right is outside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where the tomb of Jesus is at. So, I mean, it's a fabulous historical area to go to. If that really interests you, but and perhaps maybe during the semester, if it interests anybody, let me know, and we could actually do a Zoom meeting, and I can show you a bunch of other photos that I took on my training mission where I was in Israel for a couple of weeks. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so the question then, now that we kind of know where we are, why attack us? You see, a lot of Americans, ask that question. So after 9/11, a question many Americans asked, and sometimes we still ask it today, is why attack us? You see, contained within that question is the notion that we here in America see ourselves as good people living in a progressive, human rights orientated nation. Now, annually, America gives over $4 billion for humanitarian and disaster relief in countries around the globe. And we advocate for human rights. Now, other humanitarian aid is provided by private American organizations. Now, in combination, these efforts deliver food to those suffering from malnutrition, produce safe drinking water, give relief to refugees, those fleeing from war-torn areas or even drought-impacted areas. We provide training, seeds, implements, and farm animals to help individuals become self-sufficient. We also help reduce deaths from common diseases by providing inoculations or other type of medicines. We build schools that help with illiteracy and also help lower the infant mortality rate by about 10% actually. So America leads the charge to end poverty and hunger throughout the world. Now, given such data, why was the United States attacked on 9/11? So, I mean, it is a really interesting question. Now, to answer the question has really nothing to do with what Americans think about their country, but everything to do with what others think about us and how they actually experience the United States. So kind of let that sink in as we move on. And here is one poll. This is a Pew Research Center poll, and Pew Research has a lot of good information. And here you can see the ratings of religious groups. We talk about the different groups here. So ratings among Americans, ages, and then Americans' feelings warmer towards a variety of religious groups. So this is kind of an interesting chart, but we're going to look a little bit deeper, in a minute here. So that's just one chart to kind of look at. So surprisingly or not, I guess, a survey of countries whose population is predominantly Muslim revealed substantially negative perceptions of the personal traits for Western people, particularly Americans. However, when the same survey was given to non-Muslims in the United States, Russia, and Western Europe, both negative and positive traits were associated with Muslims. So again, we're going to look at a couple of different charts that basically show us how we view each other. So, you know, what's really interesting is that Americans as individually are seen negatively, but opinions about the U.S. as a whole, as a country, tend to be a little bit more favorable. So here's a chart that shows how Muslims and Westerners see each other. And these are the top 5 traits. So, I mean, take a look at this. So on the left, this is how Muslims see Westerners. The number 1 was selfish, 2 was violent, 3 was greedy, 4 was immoral, and 5 is arrogant. And Westerners, how they see Muslims. 1 was fanatical, 2 was honest, 3 was violent, 4 was generous, and 5 was arrogant. So, you know, kind of a super interesting chart, right? So now here are opinions of America by countries with predominantly Muslim populations. Okay, so countries with the lowest favorable opinions. So you have Pakistan, Jordan, Egypt, you know, the Palestine Authority, Turkey, and then the countries with the most favorable opinions, Senegal, Nigeria, Malaysia, Lebanon, and Tunisia. So I found these charts again kind of interesting. Now there is an assumption that kind of goes with this. So part of the answer to why us lies with Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Because Osama bin Laden announced to the world that one of the primary reasons for the attack was our lack of knowledge about the true political and economic conditions of the Middle East. So, you know, think about that. I have a little video at the bottom, and I'll change the link to actually spell it out so you'll know exactly what it represents. But it is actually Osama bin Laden talking about why he actually declared this jihad, if you will. So Osama bin Laden justified the 9/11 attacks as a response to America and its allies, which disrespected Islam by stationing their troops near holy sites or exploiting the riches of the region and supporting right-wing dictators. So this was, again, one of the reasons that he was talking about, and he'll mention that in the video. And Osama bin Laden made it very clear that he believed Western goals in the Middle East were much more motivated by self-interest and the quest for oil than in actually safeguarding the human rights for people in that particular land. So just, you know, some kind of interesting things to think about. And if you have never seen the actual raid on bin Laden's encampment, the first link is to the History Channel that has, I think it's about 20 to 25 minutes. It's actually very good. And then there's a shorter kind of an overview of the raid on the bottom link. The top link, you'll see the actual Situation Room where the president is there and the other high-ranking officials as this raid is actually carried out. So now we're gonna talk a little bit about Kingsley's um, 4 reasons why. So here Kingsley, who is an author, identifies 4 common whys that explain terrorism. And we'll take a look at these 4. So the first would be Western scholars blame radical Islamic interpretations of the Quran. So, and again, think about that as I'm kind of going through these. So Western scholars tend to blame terrorism on radical Islamic interpretations of the Quran. Now, that doesn't mean it's wrong. This is just what Kingsley is telling us, okay? Number 2, liberal explanations rest on the belief that social and political conditions foster authoritarianism, to which terrorism is in fact a reaction. Number 3, social and political conditions are burning embers, if you will, that fuel radical Islamic ideology, which gives rise to terrorism. And then finally, number 4, globalization and modernity, meaning, how things are becoming more modern, threaten religion and culture, and therefore terrorism is a response. So these are, again, 4 answers or reasons to the why regarding terrorism. So just to kind of finish up that part, those opposed to what they regard as the adverse features of globalization and modernity resort to terrorism in retaliation for the things being forced upon them. And it's, some people kind of believe that and some don't. But again, we're talking about things changing, or changing an entire culture, or becoming more progressive, and those that don't want to do that might result to terrorism as the answer to quash that, if you will. So again, those are the 4 whys based on Kingsley's interpretation. So now let's talk a little bit about the Prophet Muhammad and the beginning of Islam. Just to give you an idea, because a lot of you probably don't know this. And again, if you're going to study terrorism and homeland security, you really need to know a lot of the intricacies and those involved, right? So to understand the Middle East, you really must have a basic understanding of Islam. It is more than just a religion. It is a prescription for a total way of life, both individually and collectively. It visibly permeates life in the Middle East, meaning it kind of just goes, it saturates, again, including everyday life, business and government as well. Now, in contrast to the U.S., a more secular nation, where there is a separation of state and religion. So, this is kind of a sharp contrast to nations like the U.S., where there is this separation of church and state, or religion and state, if you will. So again, as I go through, I'm going to kind of throw some things up to help you learn. And here, as we're talking about Muhammad and a little bit more of Islam, I thought it would be interesting for you to look at the dress for women and some of the differences. So, it's important that we try to learn that. So for women, when in public among unrelated men, if you will, clothing must cover the entire body except for the face and the hands. When in the company of non-related males. And clothing must be loose so the shape of the body is not seen, and thick enough so that it is not see-through. and it should not resemble the clothing of men. And, so I mean, so this kind of, again, these are more of the head coverings, but you can kind of get an idea here. Now, for men, clothing must conceal whatever is between the navel and the knee. It must be loose and thick so that the private area remains concealed. All garments must be above the ankle bone. Should not resemble the clothing of women. They should not resemble something that merely seeks to kind of imitate un-Islamic practices, fashions, examples like clothing of Buddhist priests, rabbis, etc. And it cannot be made of silk or colored dye with saffron. So again, and the reason I kind of bring this up is because we're talking about the way of life, and it permeates into everything. We heard, government, business, but also dress. So that's a real big part that I think that we kind of forget from the U.S. And a little bit more on church and state. There's a really interesting article if you want to read it. This was a big to-do here in the city of Redlands, actually, where a group of individuals wanted to see that separation of church and state, because here on Redlands Police Department's original patch, they have a cross because we are the city of churches, if you will. And so they ended up changing it to this newer patch on the right-hand side. So take a look at that if you want. And whether you believe, in this or not, that's your choice. But let's keep moving on. So like Judaism and Christianity, Islam traces its lineage to the father of all people, Abraham. And according to religious tradition, Abraham was the first of these significant prophets to make covenants or agreements with God, or Allah in Arabic. And that covenant relationship became the foundation of the three faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, in Islam, the Old and New Testaments are integral parts of their tradition, and most of the Hebrew prophets are revered as messengers from God. Muslims do not believe in the divinity of Jesus, but honor him as an especially esteemed prophet, if you will. And the ultimate and final messenger within the Islamic tradition, if you will, is the Prophet Muhammad. So Muslims often say, peace be upon him, after speaking or hearing the name Muhammad, to show respect or humility. And Muhammad in Arabic means highly praised. So Islam comes from the Arabic word aslam, meaning total submission to Allah. Now, a root Arabic word for aslam is salam, which has a few meanings, but it is usually interpreted as peace. So, and I've got the different writings there so you can kind of take a look at it. Now, people of Islam are called Muslim. The word originates from the Arabic root word for Islam. So it's a contraction of Muhammad and Islam, which is how you end up with Muslim. Now, Muslim literally means one who submits himself to the will of God. So what about Muhammad now that we kind of have a little bit of an idea about some of the language and a little bit of the terminology? So Muhammad was born in 570 AD in Mecca, western coast of the Arabian Peninsula near the Red Sea. And an orphan, Muhammad was raised by his grandfather. And after his grandfather died, his uncle, Abu Talib, assumed that duty, raising Muhammad alongside his own son. And his name was Ali ibn Talib. And who after the Prophet's death became the fourth successor. So again, raised by his grandfather and his uncle, he prayed alone, much of the time seeking the truth about religion and life. And when he was about 40 years old, the archangel Gabriel visited him and revealed what cumulatively became the Quran over about a 23-year period. Now, the Quran is the holy book for Muslims, revealed in stages to the Prophet Muhammad, again, over that 23-year period. And Quranic revelations, if you will, are regarded by Muslims as the sacred word of God, intended to correct any errors in previous holy books, such as the New and the Old Testaments. So hopefully this is kind of making sense to everybody here. So again, the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad by God in Arabic. And some Quranic fragments have been dated as far back as the 8th and possibly even the 7th century. And the Quran consists of 114 surahs or chapters. So just a kind of a little bit of information on the Quran. Now, Muhammad was accepted in some places and denounced in other places. And a few times he was forced to flee for his life because of the opposition to his message. So, like Christians with the death of Jesus, followers fell into separate camps, if you will, with differences in ideology. And this too happened when Muhammad died. So that kind of makes sense, right? So after the passing of Muhammad, we had these followers that fell into two different groups. One group is Sunni, and the other is Sharia or Shiite. And again, it depends how you pronounce it. So, just kind of go with me on that. Now, in 1632 AD, Muhammad died, leaving the future of Islam to his followers. And again, like I said, like the early Christian church, the response to the followers produced profound changes. And one unintended consequence was a conflict that produced two factions, if you will, two competing factions, and that was Sunni and Shiite. So thus the emergence of these two groups. So now let's take a look at the two groups. And if you want to know a little bit more, I have an interesting little video that talks about the differences between Sunni and Shia or Shiite. Okay, so with Muhammad's death, it led to the question, who is the rightful successor? Because you have two factions, and each one of those factions, of course, thought their own way, right? And that kind of makes sense. So let's look at that. Now, we'll start with Sunni. So since Muhammad did not have a son, a procedure for selecting his successor was needed. And basically, this was to be selected on merit. So this replacement was to be selected on merit by an assembly of distinguished clerics to elect a well-qualified, pious, or deeply religious is what that word means, individual. Now, Abu Bakr was elected as the first caliph, successor to Muhammad, which is what that definition means, of Arabia, and the leader of the Muslim community, or Ummah. Okay, so again, you have a couple of different, definitions. So really quick, Ummah is the worldwide community of those that are, Islamic faithful. Okay, and the caliph is the political leader or head of that Muslim state, the successor, if you will, to the Prophet Muhammad. Okay, so hopefully we've kind of cleared this up, because again, I know there's a lot of definitions in there. Now, the clan of Muhammad living in Mecca advocated that Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, married to Muhammad's daughter, Ali ibn Abi Talib, should be the successor. So those calling for the election of Ali became the Shia, or the Shiites, or the party of Ali. Does that kind of make sense? And they believed that the leadership of Islam should be transmitted exclusively through the Prophet's bloodline, not by a group of men, kind of as we looked at. So they weren't going to have this say so. They believed that it should have been, somebody in that Prophet's bloodline. So hopefully that kind of makes sense now. And there's a lot of different, there's some different writings on each one of these, individuals. So kind of an interesting thing. Okay, so Ali eventually became the fourth caliph, and we know what that means, leading Islam from 656 AD to 661 AD. And he replaced numerous officials with trusted followers, ultimately provoking an Islamic civil war during his time that he was in power. Now, Ali was assassinated in 661, as were his two sons, Hassan and Hussein, who also became caliphs. To avoid prosecution, the Shiite fled east to the mountains of Persia, which is now Iran. And although Persians are not Arabs, the effect of the Shiite on them has been profound, reflected in every aspect of life, from literature and philosophy to politics and, of course, religion. So again, it's kind of interesting, right? So when this head person passed away, you have these two groups that were left. They each had their own idea about who should have been the next caliph, that political leader or successor to Muhammad. And you can see that there, we talked about two. So now let's look at kind of, a little bit of the difference here. So the Shia still maintain that leadership belongs to the successors of the Prophet Muhammad, the direct lineage, and they're ordained by Allah. Now, the supreme imam leads the spiritual life of the community and the political and temporal aspects of everyday life of a modern caliph, and much smaller segments of the worldwide, Muslim population, if you will. Now, the Sunni government, so just kind of comparing here, on the other hand, elects separate spiritual and political leaders. So now let's see, there's another kind of separation. So here, again, we're going to go back. The Shia, again, they still maintain that leadership belongs to the successor, of the Prophet Muhammad through that lineage. And now we got another person, another player coming in. The supreme imam leads the spiritual life of the community and the political and temporal aspects. So now you have someone that's kind of in charge of the spiritual life and politics. Okay, does this kind of make sense? And then when you go here to the Sunni, so you can see the difference. The Sunni government, on the other hand, elects a separate spiritual and political leader because they're a little more secular. Does that, and hopefully that makes sense. So the Sunni, or another name, which would be the true path of Allah, at the end of the day here, remains as the majority group in the Middle East, electing their spiritual leaders by the consensus of Muslim clerics and other leaders. And the Sunnis do represent the majority of the Islamic populations. So I'm hoping that kind of made sense a little bit. So again, that was that key distinction between the Shia or the Shiite and the Sunni, is that Sunnis elect that separate spiritual and political leader, and the Shiite, the leadership belongs to the successors of the Prophet, again by that other one individual. So hopefully that kind of makes a little bit of sense. So there's a little bit of separation there. So, definition again, just so you kind of understand, we talked a little bit about the caliph. So the caliphate or fate means a single worldwide Islam nation. So an Islamic state where the political and religious leaders are the same. So you can see how that's going to drive things. You have, because just because you believe in this religion doesn't mean you believe politically. You know what I mean? So, but if you have the same person that's in power in both, you could actually see how that could create this one worldwide type of person, right? Or nation. And that's exactly what Islam is trying to do in this particular sense. And then I just kind of threw a couple of different things in there, and we're going to talk a little bit about jihad in a little bit. And if you've never seen it written in Arabic, that's what it looks like. Okay, so what is now this concept of jihad? And again, a couple of interesting books. Understanding Jihad by David Cook is a very good book. It really helps you kind of really understand some of the ins and outs, and the origin of the holy war in Islam, kind of like where it came from and how it got there. So, that would be a really good recommendation. So, with that said, what is this concept of jihad? So, some 1.6 billion people embrace Islam in the modern world. It is the fastest growing religion on earth, with 80% of believers now outside of the Middle East. So, again, kind of interesting, right? And you can look at some of the growth here. We have another chart from the Pew Research Center, and this is, talking, 2015 through 2060, an average on what they believe about growth. Now, Islam is said to be a source of strength, a way of life, and a hope in a troubled world. And the term Islam is Arabic, meaning submission to the will of God, with roots firmly planted in the common Arabic word for peace, or salam. And this may come as a surprise to most Americans, whose perceptions are radical terrorists waging jihad against the United States. So jihad is derived from the Holy Quran, which represents using all of one's strength to overcome diversity and difficulty in that struggle to submit to the will of God. And Islamic fundamentalists actually use it to mean the term holy war. So they kind of use it in a little different twist, if you will. So again, when you talk about that spiritual struggle, it's kind of divided into an external and internal. So it's the external struggle as a process of enabling someone else to attain his or her own essence to strength, or to strengthen the community of Muslim believers. And the internal struggle as an effort to attain one's own essence and perfections over ego and other destructive emotions. So, in the words of the Prophet Muhammad, the first is, there's a couple of different jihads here. Okay, so jihad is the holy war of reaching spiritual perfection and helping others do the same. And jihad was never meant to be associated with violence. The shift of jihad towards violence occurred in the 12th century to ward off European crusaders from invading Moroccan land. And this connectivity between religion and terrorism, again, is not without controversy, because several scholars have argued that the role that religion plays in terrorism, yet few accurately depict, the complexity of the decision to commit oneself to violence and or suicide. So I want to finish up talking just a couple more things about jihad, and then we'll be done. Now, in the words of the Prophet Muhammad, the first is the greater jihad, and the second is the lesser jihad. As in Christianity, the body is considered weak and is often tempted. The struggle for greater jihad is characterized, again, as a spiritual front over one's own ego and destructive emotions, desires and thoughts, and malice and hatred, pride, arrogance, etc., which prevent a man from attaining perfection. It's not a struggle within the world itself. It's a spiritual cleansing, and as such, an act of worship. And the lesser jihad is more materialistic in nature, consisting of physical acts to assist one's family or relatives or neighbors or country, a call to strengthen the overall ummah or community of Muslim believers. So that's just a little bit of jihad. And then again, as we talk about, Islam and terrorism, how are they connected? Well, the connectivity between religion and terrorism really hasn't been without controversy. Several scholars have argued the role that religion plays in terrorism, yet few accurately depict the immense complexity of a decision to commit oneself to violence or suicide. And religion may not be the reason or motivation for terrorism, but rather a means to understanding and even accepting political and social crisis. So I have a link there to a video that talks about, Islam and terrorism, but really, what would promote or provoke somebody to do what you see in the photo right there? So, and these are all things that we have to kind of think about it. When people lose power in the present, they lose hope in the future. Heaven, hell, and paradise take on serious meaning in the justification of radical action. So, essentially, when people lose this power, they also lose that hope for the future. And because of that, when those two conditions are there, you know, and the you know, you talk about the possibility of the afterlife, and paradise, etc. This really does take on a serious meaning in the justification of whatever radical action that someone's going to take. And typically it's observed in terrorism, and suicide bombings. So, you know, again, these are some things that kind of motivate that, if you will. And there's a couple of books, if you're interested in kind of, you know, reading some of that stuff. And here are some photos, you know, when we talk about suicide bombings. So the words jihad and assassin have both been associated with, you know, Islamic terrorism today. And this is particularly true in the West, where we struggle to understand a different culture with a vastly different historical and religious heritage. Remember, religion and terrorism are evocative, meaning that they're strong images and emotions and feelings, and appeal to emotion rather than intellect, meaning emotion surpasses intellect. And, you know, so what do you think? Is there religion in terrorism? And I'm not going to answer the question. I'm just going to kind of throw that out there and let you think about it. And this is something that I want you to kind of really learn. So we're going to finish up with the 5 pillars of Islam. So Islam professes not to be a violent religion. It is sometimes viewed as a cousin to Judaism and Christianity, in that all three have a monotheistic belief in one God. Now, Islam emphasizes that all people are equal through the love of God, or Allah, and it is based on 5 major principles or pillars of faith, if you will. And these pillars represent the essential tenets of that, you know, of the Islamic faith. They are the primary obligations that Muslims must satisfy in order to live that good and responsible life. So here are the 5 pillars. The first is the testimony of faith, the shahada. And shahada means to testify or bear witness. A simple prayer. There is no true God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. It must be recited aloud with sincerity. And it's the belief that Allah is the one true God, all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-merciful. So again, that's pillar number 1 of Islam. Number 2 is prayer, the salat. And you're going to perform prayers 5 times each day: dawn, noon, mid-afternoon, sunset, and at night. And this, you know, kind of supplicants the importance of Allah in their life. And when possible, Muslims are to go to a mosque on Fridays for the noon prayer. And you're going to listen to the local cleric or the imam and give a sermon. You know, they're going to give a sermon called the kutubah. Okay, so the prayer, salat. The third pillar is giving alms, the zakat. And this is an annual payment by all adult Muslims as a reminder that what they have is a gift from Allah, and their obligations to help the needy and support Islam. The nisab is the amount owed if the Muslim exceeds a certain amount of money. And the sadaq is the amount given on a daily basis to those in observable need, those that might be on the side of the road, beggars or orphaned, etc. So that's pillar number 3, giving alms. Pillar 4 is fasting, called the Psalm. So Ramadan is the 9th month of the Arab calendar. This is where all Muslims fast from dawn to sundown, abstaining from food, drink, and sexual relations. It's a spiritual self-purification, and the nights are often spent in prayer at the mosque, or the local mosque. So that's pillar 4, fasting. And then pillar 5 is the pilgrimage to Mecca, called the Hajj. So the pilgrimage to Mecca takes place in the 12th month of the Islamic calendar. It's a once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage to the holy Kaaba in Mecca. And the Kaaba is the holy site built by Abraham for worship. And here you wear simple white clothes, and this represents the growing closer to Allah. And that would be pillar number 5. Okay, so I know that was a lot of content that we went through, but we were just a little bit over 60 minutes, which is good, so we got it into one lecture. But again, please go back through the textbook, read the chapter to kind of fill in some of the areas that I could not touch on, and then, of course, go through all of the definitions in your textbook. And don't forget, in every module related or corresponding to each chapter is going to be the matching exercise for the definitions or the key terms, and that will help you learn those quite a bit better as well. So with that said, this will conclude our Chapter 3 lecture on understanding the Middle East and Islam.